Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute once we give everybody a chance to come on in from the waiting room. All right, we got a pretty big group, so we're just going to give it about another 30 seconds before we go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. We have our friends and partners at NPD that will be making a presentation on a review of the 2021 season. Thank you to Dirk and Laura for being here today. A couple of housekeeping items that before we go ahead and get started, we will have some time at the end to get to questions. So if you do have any for them, please go ahead and use the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. We'll be keeping an eye on those. Also, I just want to remind you that June 1 is the beginning of the membership year for SIA. So if you have not yet renewed your membership, please go ahead and reach out to us at SIA. You can do it on snowsports.org or emailing support@snowsports.org. So with that, I think we will go ahead and turn it on over to Dirk and Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Maggie. We are definitely excited to be here with you today. I'm joined by my colleague, Dirk Sorenson. He's the Executive Director of US Sports and Outdoor Business. We are going to tag team today's industry review for you. We're going to look at the full season business of everything that happened in the snow business in this very unorthodox year. And Dirk's going to kick it off with an overview of kind of the macro level trends, and then he'll pass it off to me, and I'll take you through a deep dive of all the nitty gritty of your categories that you came here to hear today.
So as Laura mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and really talk a lot about what we're seeing at the macro level across the outdoor and sports landscape, as well as kind of what we're seeing generally at retail. And then Laura is going to dive a little bit more deeply into full season results in the snow industry. So Laura, if you can go ahead, and we'll just dive right in, and feel free to shoot those questions into the Q&A box as we move forward. Next slide, please, Laura. So the reason this slide's a little bit blank is, I thought a lot about conversations that I've been having across the industry. And early last year, one of the folks that I talked to that's a leader in the bike industry was telling me a fair amount about what his plans were for his snow season. He's an avid skier and loves to come to Colorado and get a couple trips in a year. And he had shared with me that he really found it very, very important to engage in cross-country activity for his 2021 plan. And I thought that was kind of interesting that rather than somebody say, the ski season is so uncertain that I just really don't know what I want to do, so therefore I'm just going to opt out, that this individual, and I think droves of others, decided to find their way to an alternative to having a snow season. And as we talk about these trends, and I think Laura dives in, you're going to see that switching behavior really, really take hold in the stories that we're going to tell. So Laura, if you could pull on the next slide. So to give you all a grounding, this data is from August to February, so not quite full snow season, but I think these trends will really resonate with you. So, active wear is up 3% to 20 billion. Athletic footwear down 1%. Outdoor sports equipment up 22% to just almost $5 billion. Team sports equipment did really quite well. And the reason for this was golf. Golf and racket sports really thrived as consumers were trying to find those solitary activities to participate in. And I think that's a real story that we need to think about as the pandemic, as people navigated, consumers navigated through the pandemic. Cycling up 54%. This really is not surprising. Like golf, like racket sports, something that people could do as a family, socially distant, getting outdoors. And I think that really this theme that we saw really emerge was outdoors, relatively distant activities, really did very, very well. Snow sports equipment up 2% through February. I'm sure there's some adjustment there that Laura will talk to in a moment. And really the breakout star, not surprising, was health and fitness equipment. So treadmills, free weights, stationary bicycles up 106% in that August to February timeframe. So one thing, well, it's fine to leave it here, Laura. What I would like to do is mention a little bit about March. So, and I think it really starts to come into play in terms of these top growing categories that we were tracking and are tracking. So through February, most of the categories that really grew or thrived, and this is absolute dollar growth from 2020 to 2021 for that time period of August 20 to February 21. So sorry for the little typo up there, but really apparel, the apparel categories that did grow were really from these cozy and indoor categories, like sweatshirts would be a great example. Footwear, one of the bigger growing categories here are basketball inspired footwear. So when The Last Dance, which is a documentary about the Bulls, came out, we really started to see some momentum in basketball inspired footwear, which kind of retro basketball shoes. And that has continued and has had a long tail of growth. And I think that's a real story and a real theme that we want to think about, which is this permanence of behavior change that occurred during the pandemic and how it's stretched throughout the pandemic. Outdoor activities like golf and cycling dominated the growth categories. Outdoor living like camp chairs, portable power have done exceptionally well. Here are goods and items that consumers could use in their backyard, at a campground, at a public park. Those types of products have done very, very well during this period. And then finally, as I mentioned before, indoor fitness. So what didn't do well? Many apparel categories struggled. So these are the activewear categories. With people not having anywhere to go, these everyday fashion items really experienced lots of decline. Similarly, like apparel, footwear, athletic footwear that were being purchased for, basically fashion, really did not thrive well. The other part of that are technical footwear like basketball, cross-training shoes that really were part and parcel of maybe formal team activities or going to gyms, didn't do well. So you can see a number of those categories in this list, like soccer and football cleats, just not doing well. Team sport cancellations really drove that. And then also back to school, with a real lack of kind of formal back to school activities and purchase activities, categories like soft-sided coolers and drinkware were down. Before I move off of this slide, what I'd like to kind of remind everybody of, or have everybody think about and talk a little bit about, is what we saw in March. As March hit, another round of stimulus hit. The economy started to feel like it was opening. People were starting to become a little bit more optimistic about return to work and return to everyday activity. And because of that, we've seen a number of categories of growth really being in some additional apparel categories as consumers are really starting to look to augment their kind of their wardrobes to get ready for kind of a return to normal. Next slide, please, Laura. So not surprisingly, the biggest brands are very much aligned to these stories of cycling, comfort and comfortable clothing to wear around the house. Those types of products did really well. You can see as you read down this list, you'll see a number of those types of brands, as well as home fitness brands and golf brands doing quite well during this pandemic as consumers were very willing to spend a little bit more money to augment their home experiences.
And Dirk, golf brands are probably the ones that, we haven't seen on this list in quite some time. Before the pandemic, we were talking about for a long time the decline of golf in terms of participation and brands, in partnership with that.
Yeah, and so when I look at these lists and really, Laura, when we came into the pandemic, usually these biggest growing brand lists really were dominated by brand apparel brands and footwear brands. And really what you saw, I think one of the big key takeaway was the rise of technical goods during the pandemic. What people, in my estimation, were doing were looking to brands and categories and having to buy incrementally. Like maybe they had a pair of shoes around or a pair of pants around that they could reuse this season, but they might not have had that stationary bike. They might not have had those golf clubs. And that's what really drove these brand growths, was the need to go find that incremental item to experience the outdoors, to do it in a kind of socially distant way and have kind of really relevant and fun activity at their fingertips. So Laura's going to get into this quite a bit more. So I'm, here's a good pulse of where the market was. Snow equipment up 13% through March. Laura was good enough to update this slide in part of my deck, so I appreciate you for that, Laura. Alpine up 8% to 857 million. Accessories up 20%. And as Laura dives into this, I think you're going to see a lot of backcountry items really being kind of the growth driver here. Snowboarding did well at 14% to 462 million. Nordic, as my opening story kind of points to, up 159%. Alpine touring 116%. And sport racks at 61%. Sport racks is a really interesting category, while small in the context of what we're talking about. As we think about next season, we can learn a little bit about what we saw in some of the other outdoor categories and cycling categories in 2020 and what happened. And one of the things that really seemed interesting to me in the data was really the growth of add-on sales, where people would buy their core items and then remember at a later date, or maybe not remember, but actually transact additional purchases later on to enhance their activity. And one of those categories really was sport racks. So what we saw was sport racks being really depressed in the early months of the pandemic. Makes perfect sense as people, were restricted and staying at home, but purchasing in mass things like cycling equipment, backpacking, camping equipment, and then later on during the pandemic, really investing in sport racks and car racks to get to the places that they wanted to. So I'd really be thinking about that behavior of consumers first buying their core items and now needing to enhance their purchase of additional items to experience the snow category.
Dirk, and I'll expand that a little bit as we get further into the webinar. But one of the things that I talked about in the mid-season webinar was the advertising that we saw from brands like Thule, because the cargo boxes were really one of the hottest items. Certainly all sport racks saw action and increases, but we saw an incredible jump in ASP because the cargo boxes were, you know, one of the most sought after item, and they were advertising it as hey, make your car the lodge, the base lodge, your base camp when you're trying to get to the mountain or get to the backcountry. And they were really driving that idea that people, you know, could make these cargo boxes, you know, work for them in a time when they couldn't get into the lodge and couldn't use those other spaces.
Yeah. So somebody asked what the difference is between my slide and this one. And really the answer resides very strongly in the inclusion of March data here. Next slide, please. Thanks. So here are your biggest kind of gainers and losers in terms of top and bottom. You know, Nordic Equipment, really the out and out kind of shining star during the pandemic, something that, you know, consumers could gravitate to, not really calculate in their kind of buying behavior, the concepts of going to resorts and, you know, navigating, going to the mountain, that sort of stuff. Snow accessories, as Laura will get into, dominated here by backcountry, and you can kind of read the rest. On the side that really was challenged, I think you go back to this idea that I presented a little bit earlier, which is what didn't you need, what you might have already had in your garage, in your closets. So outerwear tops were challenged. Things like socks a little bit challenged, because in here you have really, if you look at this view of what do people buy at resorts, those categories were really challenged. What did you need to do to purchase in person? So things like insoles really suffered and were really challenged in this pandemic, where, you know, the idea of going to a store might have been challenging for certain consumers. So here's your biggest growing brand list. Let's go ahead and skip through that, Laura. And let's talk about a little bit broader concepts here. So civic science is, we align a lot of our research activity with this organization. They have a great ability to look very quickly at the marketplace through very rapid polling and surveying work that they do. So polling is probably not the right term, but, you know, they're very good at doing rapid surveys. And I think this is really incredible to look at the economic sentiment that we've experienced through the course of, you know, most of the last rolling year. And you can see, you know, things like, you know, the steady increase of people believing that the new job market is healthy and robust, increasing over time, while at the same time you can see, you know, shortages in the home market depressing consumer sentiment around these things. But in aggregate, what we've seen is a general increase in the belief that a belief of consumers around the economy. And we really started to see that take off in March. So part of that is a highly correlated strong March for the snow season. I love this slide. This comes from our point of sale data. And really what you're seeing here is, you know, the growth of discretionary income and spend, as well as spend in consumer packaged goods. And it really gives you kind of a broad look of year over year spend. And what you can see really is, you know, a really pretty robust response of spend in the United States in general across many of our categories, week in and week out, as people navigated the pandemic. A lot of this was really driven from, or a result of, consumers spending more on food to use at home, more spend on incremental items to make their home living more comfortable. And we talked a little bit about the outdoor equipment and sports equipment, but this also extends to items like technology, computers, and so forth that people needed to use at home. Really starting in, you know, the end of March, you can really start to see really huge growth rates A lot of that is that return to normalcy. And now people really kind of saying, hey, I need to go buy things to get outdoors or get outside of the front door, I should really say. And now you're starting to see the added impact of consumers buying apparel, but consumers buying, footwear, that sort of stuff. So, this slide really is, again, this comes from an early indicator report, but I wanted to quickly show you how the inclusion of stimulus and when stimulus happened, how it's increasingly impacted retail spend. And you can see at the start of the pandemic, the first stimulus marked way back in mid-April of last year, really there was no visible bump in spend. And then you can see it as the peak of that first stimulus, you could start to see spend occurring. That second stimulus occurring in October had moderate impact, and this third stimulus, you can see really extreme impact. So as people talk a lot about what's next, and we look at this March spend, I think we have to be a little bit nuanced about what we believe will happen next year and in the outgoing months, as we may not have those stimulus payments driving the behavior that we're seeing here.
And Dirk, this also goes back to that question that Roger asked you about the difference between data through February and data through March. I think we'll see in a lot of the slides that I have to show that, there was definitely a big uptick in the industry in terms of performance across categories with the addition of March data.
Absolutely. So I think it's worth thinking about in terms of the long view, changes to our population pyramid. And the reason I think this is important for anybody in the outdoor business, in sports and in snow to really think about is how big each of these age cohorts are and what they're experiencing. So the age, children under the age of 8, that's a growing cohort in the United States. Children between 8 and young adults under 28, really that's slightly shrinking. Millennials are now growing, and I think this is a really critical age group. Laura might be able to testify here if she's willing to. There's a lot of changing behaviors that occur when you are in the age group between 28 and 44. Many people are buying their first homes. Many people are having children. This changes your behavioral spend. You're looking for family activities. You may be moving away from, going to, social events and thinking about what do I do to go camping or go skiing as a family. So I just encourage us all to really think about what's next in a macro sense as people age into different experiences. And I think this slide really speaks to that quite well. The boomer group is absolutely, you can see this group of 68 and older, really, the proportion of growth there is absolutely massive. These people are really looking and probably by necessity looking for new challenges and new opportunities to experience the outdoors, and we have to adjust to that.
I can attest to what Dirk is saying as I'm in the thick of it right now. I've just returned a few days fresh off of maternity. So as I'm going through my slides, please cut me some slack if you hear some baby cries in the background.
Yeah. But I think the real critical part here too, not just, what Laura's experiencing, but just generally is when you get to certain ages, those cutoff points make you think a little bit differently about the activities you want to engage in. So I think this is a story worth telling and repeating. When the pandemic hit, consumers really shifted to online. And this is a macro slide. This isn't just snow. This isn't just outdoor sports, but this comes from our checkout tracking service. It's a few months old, but you really see this kind of permanent shift to online spend. Many of us thought that we would arrive at a point where online spend would see some major increases, but not quite as robust and quick as probably what the pandemic triggered. So a few survey questions that we put out, again, as part of what we do with our friends at Civic Science. I think this is really interesting what people plan to do in 2021. You can see out hiking and walking really being a sought after new activity. At-home fitness will continue. Other outdoor activities, again, a lot of interest. One of the things I think is interesting is really diving into the weeds here a little bit and looking at the age groups that are saying they're going to participate in some of these activities. So golf, for example, a lot of pre-pandemic belief was, this was a category maybe under struggle, but it's really going through a period of reinvention, and it's actually bringing in a very young demographic now. So you can see 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds are saying that they want to do more golf in 2021. So I think it's worth also visiting kind of in general what people kind of gravitated to during the pandemic. Recreational vehicle sales up up to 22 billion, boat sales 42 billion. And by boat sales, we're not talking kayaks here, we're talking motorized boats. Golf course and country club spend 26 billion, and at-home fitness 5.5 billion. So these are big growing categories that really were triggered or spurred to major growth because of the pandemic.
And Dirk, just because the boats number here excludes paddle boards and kayaks and things like that, It is important to note that those saw some really extreme growth last year as well. Exceptional growth,
and continuing into 2021 and into March. One of the bigger categories of growth in March were some of the kayaking categories and human powered kayaks and boating.
Right, and all those accessories that go along with it.
Mm-hmm. So, what was hard hit, and, this slide, I think, will echo, I think, for many of you in this business, many cities that really had a thriving retail performance, somewhat based on tourism, took a real hit during the pandemic. We have a little bit of data that we collect as part of some of the other efforts that we have at NPD. And I can tell you that this pattern that you're seeing here really extended to the ski resorts, particularly in in March of last year, and then November, December of this year. We saw some traffic data that we collect using GPS and some other technologies, that resort traffic was down 15 to 20% at most of those places, even while people were willing to explore and use some of those resort communities as kind of home bases to new outdoor activities. Nonetheless, those resorts really took some hits in terms of traffic of resort towns. So plans to travel, I think this really starts to paint a picture of where we're going next. As the pandemic really has emerged, you can see this green line basically stating even through the holiday season of 12/13, 12/27, almost 80% of people are saying that they didn't plan to travel. Since that time, we're starting to see increases of interest in travel. So now that I don't plan to travel line is down 60%. My suspicion is if we did that now again in now in June, you'd see that number far, far lower. So I think, consumers are really showing, and you're seeing in the media, a lot of interest in travel and a lot of interest in people getting out and starting to experience a sense of normalcy. I really firmly believe, just anecdotally and talking to coworkers and so forth, that interest in 2021 and 2022 ski season and resort travel to those locations is going to be exceptional. That's a personal belief just based on conversations that I have. And with that, Laura, have at it, and let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in the weeds of the snow categories.
Thank you, Dirk. I'll take it from here. So two main factors that affected snow equipment sales this season. First, the weather, and then of course the pandemic. So looking here at fourth quarter precipitation, we saw snow levels were much below average from California to Colorado, and then below average throughout the Rocky Mountains. In January and February, we did see some improvement to average or to slightly below average. And then despite those headwinds from both weather and the pandemic, the NPD tracked universe for the snow industry saw an improvement of 4% in dollars sold, ending the season from August to March at $7.8 billion. So this, some of this was shown in the slide that Dirk talked through. This is updated to show the full season performance. And it's also inclusive of not just equipment and accessories, but also apparel, which is as you know, the largest business in terms of dollars sold. So while dollars grew 4%, units actually softened slightly. And while many categories we did see unit growth, the seasonal gains were actually influenced by higher average selling prices. Low inventories on technical equipment meant consumers were eager to snap that product up and that they weren't looking for bargains. And then within apparel, the largest of the three major categories, double-digit growth was seen across sportswear bottoms and tops. And this has actually been true, particularly in sweatshirts for some time now. If you've attended previous NPD SIA webinars that I've produced, you've heard me mention this trend. This is, you know, in specialty and specialty e-commerce channels driven by brands, outdoor brands like the North Face and Patagonia, and then within the Snow Chain channel of business, there's more athletic branded influence there. And then apparel categories saw gains from net gaiters in particular. Those oftentimes people were using in place of face masks. So we saw a lot of action happening within that category over this past season. And then also a true sort of indication of people getting out there and being active on the snow is the performance of outerwear bottoms, which saw a jump of 10%. And then in equipment, the backcountry growth story that Dirk touched on is something that we've been telling, you know, this entire season, and certainly it kicked off at the end of last season really significantly. And that also, as I mentioned to Dirk, included sports racks that were driven higher up in ASP by those cargo boxes. And then lastly there, in accessories, backpacks, specifically the specialized Avi packs, drove some of that growth. And then also sunglasses saw some significant improvement as well. So I mentioned slightly the increases in average selling prices. This was seen across equipment categories. Shows that while all major categories experienced healthy ASP changes, it was Nordic accessories and sport racks that really made that hit into that double-digit range. So Nordic was in high demand. Retailers were able to hold price throughout the season. And then accessories was driven up, as I mentioned, by those higher ticket backcountry safety items. And then again, sport racks benefited from the growth of those higher priced cargo boxes. So getting into the category level now, so monthly performance of major equipment categories helps illustrate the impact of COVID. COVID concerns were very high coming out of last season. They remained high in the summer and then especially in the start of the fall of 2020. We saw Nordic and AT equipment surge at the end of last season. Consumers were really ready to pounce on the new inventory that came out at the start of this season. And then new cases we saw across the country rise exponentially in November. They remained elevated in December, just as ski season was really starting to kick off. Some resorts opened late, but most really implemented varying degrees of restrictions. So the COVID case count didn't actually start to subside until January. Oh, excuse me, just a moment. There we go. By contrast, alpine ski and snowboard sales, those declined through the early months and the most important months of November and December. And then in January, when we started to see COVID cases begin to decline, we also got some better snow and sales in those resort categories ticked up. Alpine equipment sales were down 10% through November, but they bounced back 39% between January and March. And for snowboard, which tracked down 4% in the first half of the season, it came back 45% growth over last season. Overall, though, because the latter half of the season accounts for less share of the total season sales, alpine equipment actually ended the season up 8%, and then snowboard overall improved 14%. So looking at the year-over-year monthly sales change by channel, internet, which is of course exploded in growth at the end of last season, it continued to grow significantly throughout this season as well. Concerns about COVID in the fall and December, specialty brick and mortar shops, they really struggled until about after the new year. Chains grew in every month after August, mostly because their ability to capture those online sales and then also offering buy online and pick up in store. One thing that I want to note before I jump off of this slide is the way that we segment some of the specialty dealers' internet business. So Snow Specialty here is really just indicative of those brick and mortar sales. For the retailers that have a robust online business and the ability to segment those sales and their reporting to us, those do get parsed out and put into the internet channel of business. So if specialty looks extra depressed in certain ways, it's because it's not indicative of the online business that takes place there. So here we have sales by category on the right and sales change on the left. Between the two categories, alpine skis grew the most by new dollars sold because many consumers were mounting them with alpine touring bindings. And then after alpine skis, alpine touring boots, and alpine touring boundings, both considerably smaller in size than their alpine counterparts, they were the second and third categories adding the most new dollars this season. To further prove this trend, we can look at unit sales of AT bindings versus AT skis over the last couple seasons. So last year, about 15,000 more bindings were sold than skis. And this year, the gap was 56,000. So those 56,000 bindings are being mounted on skis sold as alpine skis. In terms of units, the growth of flat skis is more evidence that consumers wanted the flexibility to mount alpine touring bindings. So you see unit sales by ski type here. You have flat skis on the left up 11% and system skis on the right were flat at 0.5% growth. And then looking at ski performance by waist width, the most popular ski segments remained in the 80 to 90 and 91 to 100 millimeter widths. However, we did see that growth in the widest skis, which we could expect with the shift towards backcountry, but the widest waist widths of greater than 110 millimeters, that posted the highest percent change growth of dollars sold at 44%. That segment, however, remains the smallest by units sold and by volume. And then having a look at alpine and alpine touring by channel. So specialty shops certainly account for the highest share of sales for both alpine and AT equipment. But internet, as was true of so many other categories throughout the pandemic, did very well for alpine. That trend didn't prove true for AT equipment though. This certainly because AT equipment can be more specialized and people really want that in-person expert fitting touch for it. So all channels saw significant growth within AT, but those customers really remain loyal to the specialty shops where they could get that high touch service. 65% of those sales occurred there, and dollar growth was triple digits at 140%. So this was especially true for AT boots. Nordic equipment performance is something really exciting to talk about. Incredible really across the board. This was not, true necessarily going into the pandemic. We were seeing some depression there, but more dollars were sold in this category this season than the last 2 seasons combined. So that's really incredible to talk about. All subclasses within the category registered triple-digit growth. Boots adding the most in absolute dollars sold, and then closely followed by skis. And then all channels shared in the success of the Nordic category, but Snow Specialty far and away led those category gains. The channel accounted for 80% of the dollar growth of Nordic. That translated to $77 million. Snow Internet overtook Snow Chain this season for dollars sold by volume within Nordic. That channel posted 209% growth of dollars sold. And then Snow Chain also saw considerable growth for the category, but at 43%, that pales in comparison to what took place in the other channels. And then at a high level, what we saw from snowboard equipment, sales here did capture some action. The category grew, as I mentioned before, 14% for this season to a total of 462 million. This was shared across segments. So snowboards were up 16%, boots were up 8%, and then bindings grew 17%. So we'll look a little bit deeper at what happened there. Every type of snowboard contributed to the, internet sales, snowboard equipment sales by channel. So internet sales added the most new dollars to the category, while sales growth in Snow Specialty was, more tepid. I think this is a good time, again, to mention that for specialty business, if they do have an online presence and the ability to report that to us separately, those sales are represented in the internet channel. And that's where we saw that 35% growth, adding 40 million over last year. And then the types of snowboards. So one of the questions that I received in the Q&A box earlier was related to split boards. So certainly, given the action happening in the backcountry, there's interest to know, what split boards did in terms of performance or contribution to the overall snowboard class of performance. And really what we saw was that every type of snowboard contributed to the market gains, with freeride being the most notable for the absolute dollar gains, both this season and last season. Split boards, however, they showed growth both seasons, with dollar sales almost doubling this season at a growth rate of 92%. So this is more notable when you consider the price barrier to entry for split boarding. So on the right, you see that we have the #1 selling split board called out there. It has an average ASP of $868. This is considerably higher than the other types of snowboards within snowboard. And to prove that point a little bit further, the majority of snowboards, when we exclude split boards, are sold between the $300 and $500 segment. And the under $200 segment this year, we actually saw a big jump this past season. It now represents about 20% share of the market. So split boards did see some action at that really, really high price point. But again, that below 200 segment also saw some action. And then each of the major accessories categories posted growth over last season too. However, snowshoes grew 121% and backcountry accessories gained 87%. Those obviously speak to the limited access at resorts and then seeing consumers heading into the backcountry and the side country. Here's a look at, the #1 selling snowshoe, the #1 beacon, and the #1 skins, all seeing tremendous performance this past season. And then as we saw on the previous slide, goggle sales were up 9% in dollars sold, and we also recognized a 6% increase in units sold. So that translated to a growth in average selling price of just under 4%. When we look a little closer at what took place within the price brackets, the below $50 segment took some of the unit share of sales, as did the 100 to 150 segment, and then the above 200. The biggest growth was there in the middle in the 100 to 150 range. Smith really controls this market in this segment, and they were primarily responsible for the unit share growth that took place within it. And then the same view for helmets illustrates that, close to half the category is sold in the $50 to $100 range. Unit sales, we saw shift to the 150 to 200, and then the 200 and above segments. So this is what translated to that ASP growth of 6%. Some of the key takeaways from today, obviously due to the pandemic, we couldn't all be on the mountain as we were before. So it forced us to invest in new gear to recreate in new ways. Certainly the gear that allowed us to get into the backcountry and then into the side country performed best. We'll see some of this subside as pandemic pressures ease and we can get back to the resorts. The resorts are also some of them offering discount passes, really trying to get skiers and snowboarders back to that lift serve terrain. COVID helped introduce or reintroduce a lot of Americans to new snow activities or other outdoor activities. As we begin to inch back to that normalcy, some consumers will, go back to their pre-pandemic activities of choice. So be that back to the gym, back to the yoga studio, group fitness, whatever it was. But some of this is going to, stick around, and people are going to remain engaged in those new activities that they picked up during the pandemic. So while some of these growth rates will start to subside, we do expect that we have a lot of new consumers in both the outdoor and our snow categories, which is certainly a fantastic thing. Let's, as an industry, do all we can to keep them here. So if you have any questions on the data that we presented today, you can certainly reach out to SIA directly, or you can reach out to me here. My email address is noted on this slide. I can help take you through any of the insights that we analyzed, or answer any questions that you might have. Maggie, are there any more questions that came in from the group?
I have one or two more if you guys have a minute to answer.
Yep.
What has been the effect of stimulus in outdoor? Have you seen any?
Yeah, so earlier on in a slide that I presented, you could see the general impact of stimulus. It's really hard to draw the exact conclusion that stimulus equals this, but when infusions have happened, particularly that infusion in March, we really saw a boom in spend. I think there was a question earlier about what was the difference between the early data that I presented that excluded March, and then the enormous growth rates that you saw with the inclusion of March that Laura was showing. I think that's just a really strong indication of how stimulus really, especially with March, translated to sales in the snow space. Laura, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think, yeah, you illustrated that on a slide earlier where we really saw those peaks of the stimulus checks hitting the market. We saw that lift towards the end of the season, and expect that, as you said, that may taper off as we move forward.
I think another, just a little adder, I guess, to consumer behavior and consumer spend that we have seen in outdoor and in sports generally is where supply seems to become limited. We're definitely seeing this in bike and probably certain snow categories that we've talked about, like the backcountry equipment. Consumers have really shown their willingness to seek out those items and buy them at full retail, if not more, when they can find them. So I think with March, you kind of saw this a little bit of resupply, combined with stimulus in the marketplace to drive certain outdoor category growth.
Thank you. And I know you talked a little, you dipped your toes in a couple times, but do you have any projections on what we're looking at moving forward?
Yeah, it's a $24,000 question, right? What's
Right?
going to happen next? And I don't think any of us know the answers. I think there's probably questions that you should be asking yourselves as we watch this. One that Laura pointed to in her key takeaways was, how quickly do we see people return to old behaviors as we kind of have this sense of normalcy, at least in the United States? Will people go back to gyms? Are those behaviors that we used to engage in, easily return to? And if we really see symbols or signifiers in the market that people have kind of permanently adapted to a new normal, I think you have to start to think about what does that mean for your categories of business. One of the thoughts I had as Laura was presenting her takeaways is, and she was so spot on, which is think about a little bit this new embedded base of consumers that have purchased added snow, more, snowboards, for example, or backcountry equipment. Are they going to be inclined in 2021, 2022 to continue those activities, or are they going to return to other snow activities? I don't think we have the answers, but I think we should be asking those questions and looking for data points like traffic into resort communities. Will 2021's behavior of going to lakes and rivers to enjoy water sports activities continue, or will people go back to maybe public pools? Those are the types of things I would be looking at to think about trends moving into the future. Laura, you might have a little bit of thought about what you look at too, to kind of think about what's going to happen next.
No, I just referenced my crystal ball that I keep in the corner.
Fair enough. It's very dynamic. I think that's the real, answer. Here at NPD, we certainly look at a range of information, everything from restaurant traffic to credit card spend in certain categories and so forth. We're really trying to figure it out, but as I said at the outset, there's no magic answers right now. Just really what to look for.
All right, thank you both. There's got a couple more that came in. So real quick, do you guys have any data on the growth of backcountry safety courses and how that relates to the growth of backcountry gear?
I don't have that data point. I think that it might be hard to kind of wrap your arms around that unless we went to, one main industry source to provide that information. But I think those courses are offered, in a lot of different areas. And so it's hard to get a grasp on, what the increase was in that particular area. Certainly it would have correlated to the growth that we saw within, backcountry equipment and accessories. Although, sadly we did see, I think a record high in terms of avalanche deaths this past year.
Yeah, I think Laura's answer is really spot on, which is both the engagement in all three, the unfortunate accident rate, the increase in signups for backcountry classes, as well as the increase in consumption of equipment. They're all kind of caused by consumers that just love snow sports activity and were not going to be denied because resorts might have been limited. So time will tell what will happen in 2021, 2022.
For sure. And then do you have any data on or any insights onto the employee shortage and how it's affecting the industry?
Dirk, I'll let you speak to that.
I really don't have anything on that to this specific industry. It's certainly a macro trend worth watching, which, you know, we're certainly see playing out in the short term in the restaurant space, which is how quickly can restaurants kind of return to normal with employee shortages and so forth. A lot of what's interesting is there has been an economic readjustment to where people wish to work. So it's not just, you know, people willing to return to the workforce, it's where they're going. So our consumers, or not consumers, but is the employee workforce or the workforce maybe switching to driving jobs like Uber and, you know, Lyft and delivery options maybe, as opposed to going back to service work. Those are, I think, emerging trends to be watching.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And I think that wraps it up for today. So
Maggie, can I jump in real quick too? I just want to know, Eric brought to my attention that there was a typo in the total snow industry slide where Nordic was showing not as high of an increase. So Nordic and Alpine, those percent changes in dollars sold were 159% for Nordic and 112% for Alpine Touring. So the deck will be shared out and those two figures will be corrected on that slide. So it'll match, you know, throughout the rest of the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying. That's very helpful. And as Laura said, we will be sharing this presentation and recording of the session for you to look back on. But Dirk and Laura, thank you so much for your time and expertise. And to all our attendees, thank you for spending the last hour with us as well. So we look forward to seeing everybody soon and seeing where we go from here. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.